It was 2 years ago, the legendary 60 Minutes bade farewell to Steve Craft. After 30 years and some 500 stories, 11 Emmys and 5 Peabody Awards, and more importantly, a lifetime of outstanding journalism. Steve was the first American reporter on the grounds in Chernobyl. His Stay By Your Man interview with Bill and Hillary Clinton produced one of the defining moments in American political history, and after 16 interviews with Barack Obama, he still carefully maintained a reporter-subject relationship with the president. Steve, it's a pleasure having you with us. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and appreciate everything that you're doing, and happy to be included in the very illustrious group of people that you're talking to.
You know, there's one thing you said time and again, it's always about the story. Steve, what makes a story a story? What is indispensable?
You know, it's 60 minutes. I think Don Hewitt, the creator and executive producer, would say, tell me a story and tell me something that I don't know. That's basically it. Something that's of interest, and tell me something that's important. Tell me something that I'd be fascinated with, and make me look at the world a little bit differently than I did before this story was done.
You know, anybody who does television reporting knows the tension between the written text and the visual image. And right. Television very often prefers the latter, and we as journalists very often are committed to the former. Do you remember an incident in which you lived the tension between the two?
Well, you always feel the tension between the two, particularly if you try. There are certain kinds of stories that are particularly investigative stories that you just can't do because, first of all, it requires somebody to come on camera and say something, and preferably not in shadows, which we're not a big fan of. We're never a big fan of at 60 Minutes, or disguised voices, only in extreme circumstances. But it was helped by Don Hewitt's original concept that he believed that people listened to television and didn't watch television. And so you need to write for the ear, and you need to, you can't lose them. You've got to keep the audience engaged sentence to sentence by sentence by sentence. And I think that was a real stroke of genius on Don's part, and I think it's true. I do think that the narrations on these stories are more, just as important as the interviews and the ways that
is it true that he would often watch the first drafts of a story with his eyes closed?
Or looking down at the script, usually looking down at the script.
Not on the screen?
Not at the screen.
And yourself, is it right that you pulled night, you know, till dawn, just rewriting and rewriting the text?
It's true. It's true, in part because of the way I worked, and in part because of the demands of the job. You know, the demands of the job, you would be fully involved in whatever it was that you were doing, and whether it was being on the road for a week or 2 weeks or in a row, shooting stories, and then coming back and trying to get them on the air. And you would have a deadline, and they say, well, we'd like the story this week. And I always found it easier to work in the afternoon. And because you're dealing with a number of different producers and a number of different stories, not just one, I always thought it was kind of easy to spend the first part of the day clearing away the things that were going to interfere with concentrating on the story.
And then writing through the night. It makes two of us, for whatever it's worth. But let's go to the other side of the spectrum, to the television part of the spectrum. You still remember, Steve, what happened when you asked Clint Eastwood if it wasn't somewhat unconventional to have 7 children from 5 women? What happened when you asked the question?
Well, I had a long conversation with my producer about how we were going to ask the question and the phrasing of the question, because I figured that he would go, I didn't know what he was going to do. I thought he would get angry. I thought he would, but he just didn't do anything. He just looked at me and gave me this stare like, you just made a serious mistake. Let's see where we're going with this. And it was really chilling. And the pause went on much longer than the pause that we had to edit the pause down because it was really long before I came back.
But you had to make the decision whether you interrupt the pause, but you decided to wait because you figured there is power to silence.
Yes, and that's something that's very underestimated in television. There's nothing more powerful than silence. Even 3 or 4 or 5 seconds is an eternity. And it's an effect that a lot of people don't use or don't realize the importance of. It's very powerful. There's nothing he could have said in that that got his point across more succinctly.
Stronger than that. And if someone, Steve, were to ask you, did 60 Minutes essentially produce clean kind of stories so that it could run in-depth investigative pieces about Saddam Hussein and the military and corruption and money laundering, what would you say? That with a spoonful of sugar, the medicine goes down? You need Clint and Seinfeld and Woody Allen to run the other kind of stories?
Yes, I think so. And I think one of the successes of 60 Minutes was the variety and the fact that they were essentially 3 acts. And you tried to have in the mix of stories, the ones that ran in a particular show was very important to how the viewer's reaction after the story aired, or while the story was going on, whether they liked it or not. And I think that we tried to have one investigative story. We tried to have one sort of background story that put people up to, brought people up to speed and expanded on something that might be in the news that day, that week, last year. And then something at the end that was lighter, had to do with the art or culture or entertainment. Let's
talk about the tougher part, or the in-depth kind of stories, the ones that carry dilemmas with them. When you take on a serial killer, and I believe you were the only one who interviewed a serial killer on 60 Minutes, was it Charles Culler, right? Believed to have murdered hundreds of people. You remember agonizing over the possibility that you give him fame rather than shame?
Yes, I think that that's obviously part of the equation, and you struggle with that all the time. I don't think that we made him famous. He was not really that well known, but I think that we gave people insight into this particular serial killer, who happened to be a nurse at a number of different hospitals and kept getting passed from one to the other after he was caught or suspected of maybe killing somebody.
So do you set yourself a challenge before you approach such an interview? There's something that I want the viewer to stay with, something that I want to sink in?
Yes, you don't always know what that's going to be before you go and do the interview, though. What you want to do is to try and bring out all the possible reactions that you might get and explore them while it's going on. And you never really know. I never really know when the camera turns on what we're going to end up using or what we're not, because it takes on a life of its own once the interview gets started.
Right. And
you have to make the decisions afterwards in what you're going to include and how you're going to set it up.
And there's one thing that we both know. When you expose, say, a corrupted congressman or a fabricator writer, which you did both, someone's life is going to change forever after the piece airs. And I guess that's perhaps the cruelest definition of our profession, the fact that we influence in such a way people's lives. Ever had a second thought about the story because of that?
There's some stories that I felt that influence or that feeling. I had that feeling. And other one was a story we did on Greg Mortensen, who was wrote a book, very famous book called something, 2 cups of tea or something like that. I can't remember. And had become a real advocate for women education in Afghanistan, and built a lot of schools. And it turned out that a number of his colleagues came to us and said that there are real problems with this, that the money's not being totally properly accounted for, that the claims are being exaggerated. It was a very hard story to do. And I think a lot of people said, well, why are you destroying this guy's life? I don't know if we destroyed his life or not. But I think that we had, because he was raising money from the public, that it was important that that people understand the circumstances and the issues with the story. I felt bad about it at the time. I really did. But in the end, I think it was important that we did the story. Otherwise, things continue. If things are going wrong, if you don't try and put a stop to them, and you allow them to continue, then if something happens that you may regret later on for not doing the story, you have to be conscious of that too.
I guess that's a more romantic definition of our profession. I will lend you, Steve, one of my own dilemmas. It happened just the other day. We were about to air an investigative piece about a prominent public Israeli figure who sexually assaulted tens of young boys and girls for decades. Mm-hmm. He tried to commit suicide roughly 12 hours before we went on the air, hospitalized in an unstable condition. We had to make a decision whether to run the story at 9:30 p.m. or not. He was still hospitalized. He still is. Would you go ahead with it? What would you have decided?
Well, I don't know the circumstances of the story. I think that, I don't know, that's really a tough one. I haven't been in exactly that situation. I've done stories where I worried about what kind of an effect it's going to have on the person that we were doing the story.
We decided to run the story, particularly because the victims were so traumatized and devastated, because the story was so unique, because his monstrous character was so dark, and because it was so evident that these factors overshadow his own tragedy. But yeah, you can never know. And eventually we got, the public sentiment was with us. But that brings me to the next question. There's one fascinating phenomena that I discovered. Right and left roughly divided on the issue of whether we have to run the story or not on social media, almost like a reflection of the basic right-wing sentiment against the media in this country and in yours. Many on that side of the aisle were opposing the broadcast, which brings me to the American version of this phenomena, aka Donald Trump. And first of all, how come you never interviewed President Trump? Never tried?
How come I didn't?
Yeah, because you interviewed President Obama 16 times.
Did. Scott Pelley did, Leslie Stahl did.
I know.
I think that where you talk about the competitive nature of this, I did a lot of interviews with President Obama, and I think people on the show felt that it was time to give somebody else those stories and not try and continue this, what was seen by some people as a monopoly. But also, I think that he was never somebody that I really wanted to interview.
Why?
Because he just is, he's a bully. He just won't stop talking. And I've watched interview after interview after interview. It's like a runaway train. And you get very little out of it other than him showing off his worst characteristics.
I'm sure you watched Leslie Stahl's last interview with President Obama, him bullying her, dismissing her, cutting the interview short. Did you try to think what would you have done had you been sitting in her place?
With Obama or with Trump?
With Trump. Her last interview with Trump when he cut it short.
Right. Well, I think that's a good example of I think that the most powerful part of that interview was the question that Leslie brilliantly asked her, wasn't really a question, it was a statement, Mr. President, we can't put things like that on the air if they're not true. And some of these things you're saying are not true. It was, I thought, incredibly well handled. And I think she called him out to everybody who was watching that. I thought that was what I was left with in terms of the, you could tell Leslie's frustration. I think that she did a good job. I mean, if a few people have done good jobs, I think Lester Holt of NBC did a very good job with President Trump early. I think that Chris Wallace did a good job with Donald. I think Leslie did a good job with Leslie, but with Trump. But I think that Trump's animosity towards 60 Minutes was much greater than it was to NBC or to Fox.
So she had a tougher. She had a tougher challenge. But you quoted her saying, "Mr. President, we cannot run lies on the air." And basically speaking, truth perhaps doesn't matter anymore after Trump's era because lying has been normalized. I mean, we could have reported from Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania that, no significant election fraud was detected, and the mob still stormed the Capitol, truly believing that Biden stole the election. How did it get there? How did it happen that lies have been normalized?
Well, it's certainly been accelerated by the volume of news coverage and the volume I associate it with social media, I associate it with online journalism, I associate it with talk television on cable. There's so many voices out there, and everybody wants to be heard, and everybody is playing to their own base, so to put it, if you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They're not interested in presenting both sides of the story or any kind of balance. They want to give their audience red meat to get the ratings. And so there's nobody that stops and says, wait a minute, that's not true. You can't say that. That just doesn't happen. And so the public has sort of been deluged with all this stuff. And I think in the end with Donald Trump, a majority of the people managed to realize that he was not to be believed and understood the game that was being played. And so I think people have to make their own judgment. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think what you're trying to do with Shomrim, am I saying that right?
Shomrim, yes, you're doing good.
Is to fill a void that has been created by the collapse of the financial infrastructure that supported journalism forever, really.
So you have the feeling that the old model of news being financed by financial organizations that own mainstream media outlets is obsolete or almost obsolete?
I would say it's becoming more and more irrelevant. It used to be when you had 3 networks and local newspapers in every town, sometimes more than one, you got a lot of things that you could, there were choices. And there was also some professional standards. And also, obviously newspapers had their own point of view and some television stations had their own point of view.
But they had professional standards.
They had professional standards. There was a certain amount of training that went on to get one of these jobs. They were hard, not easy to get to. They weren't very well paid. And the people that generally took them were committed to certain principles. And I think that's what's changed. It's not completely new because certainly if you go back to the early 20th century with the muckrakers and the progressive movement, which was important and fulfilled very important role by exposing the wrongs of society.
But what you're saying, Steve,
to Hearst in the Hearst Empire.
Right. But what you're saying, Steve, which is rather sad and pessimistic, is that those of us who still believe in professional journalism, in not catering to any base, looking for the facts and reporting them honestly might become something of the past in the foreseeable future. That's not what people want to get.
Well, I think right now what is important, and this is why I think that this effort is of the the independent, not publicly financed but donor-based,
yes,
is so important, because somebody needs to fulfill that role, and there needs to be right now. There is a void there. Not very many people are doing it. And even this is my own opinion, I think even the mainstream organizations, the most powerful and most journalistically reputable organizations in the country have sort of lost their way a little bit and have allowed the editorial opinions to creep into the news sections.
Did you have that feeling in your last days or weeks or months on 60 Minutes? That something is changing?
Yes, I think a lot of things are changing. I think everything is changing.
No, but in the sense that you had the feeling that there's no listening to the kind of reporting that you did in the 80s and the 90s.
Well, I was very fortunate in that I was working at 60 Minutes, because we still had an audience of between 10 and 15 million people on most weeks that tuned in. That's a huge audience in the United States, particularly when everything else is so fragmented. So it wasn't so much that it was taking place where I was, it was more taking place on the outside.
Right, right. And I got to ask you, and feel free not to answer that question. Was there ever economic or advertisers' pressure applied on you via your executives, your managers, not to run a story, not to investigate one because it might be harmful economically for the network?
A few times.
What did you do?
It was some of it in things like this are, I won't say self-censorship, but you know that there's certain rails that you don't want to touch, and that I'll give one of them, and that's the National Football League. And to a certain extent, all of the networks, it's one of the most lucrative properties that they have, all the ones that are involved with the NFL, and the NFL is a monolithic organization. And certainly there was if you were going to do a story about problems within the NFL, problems with injuries, or the danger of the sport, or particularly the NFL teams conspiring to try and bury the problem or hide the research information, that was going to create lots of problems. And we dipped into that a few times discreetly. But I think that you don't go. And I think, be honest with you, I think that it's also a problem for the kind of journalism Shomrim wants to do, because you have to be very, in the word of caution, you have to be steadfast and not let your donors influence what stories you're covering.
No question about it. But
it's very hard.
Right. And the one thing that we both know is that the real challenge, the real moral test, is the moment you get the first tip. Do you follow that tip, or do you apply self-censorship? And that's something which we seldom think about. I have to ask you one more question about Donald Trump. His rough relationship with the media is well known. TV made him in a way and then repented it in a way. On a scale of 1 to 10, Steve, what grade would you give the American press with regard to its coverage of Donald Trump? Was it a failure, a fiasco, a success, neither of them?
I think it's very complicated. I think that the press in many ways was responsible for Donald Trump, and particularly in the early stages of his campaign, in the way it was covered and the whole way the debates were handled. I think that in some ways, it was always a dilemma. Do you attack him and you straight on and maybe cross the editorial bipartisanship line by condemning something that's completely out of line? knowing that the people that support him are only going to be aggravated and respond against you, the press. And that was what he was very successful at doing.
Exactly, exactly. That's where we become an asset rather than a liability for him. And we experience a very similar dilemma in this country. Of all the people that you interviewed, Steve, of all the situations that you shot, of all the places you've been to, is there one instance, one moment, one shot, one person, one sentence that stays with you more than most others?
I think the situations mostly where you were in some sort of danger at war, and in Beirut or El Salvador, or where I got my first reporting job in Vietnam.
As a soldier, basically, as a military.
Right, I was working for Stars and Stripes, which was the American military newspaper. I was in the Army, but I was a reporter, and those circumstances certainly stay with you. Anything that sort of tests your mortality, but yeah, one of the things that is so gratifying to me is that there's not just one or two, but there's so many, and so many interesting people. I really had the good fortune of being able not only to work with some of the people I idolized when I was a young reporter, but also to meet people that were wonderful journalists or fantastic actors, or interviewing Maggie Smith or Clint Eastwood or
Jerry Seinfeld.
Yes, Jerry Seinfeld, yes, and get to have the opportunity to spend time with him, or President Obama.
What was it about President Obama that made him, for you, different than any other politician you've ever met?
I think he had, well, first of all, I had more access to him than any other politician that I've ever had. The one thing that I thought really struck me was the fact that he always seemed to know the answers. You could ask him a very complicated question, and you could tell from his answers and the way he tried to answer them that he was fully informed. He didn't have to turn to his aides or ask them any questions. And am I saying this right? Is that wrong? But he never, I can't remember an instance when he did it.
Deep and eloquent, almost like Donald Trump. Yeah.
This is my own opinion, knew nothing about what he was doing. Well, he knew what he was doing. He had,
in a way, yeah, right,
yeah,
right.
At some level, he was very clever. And very manipulative, and able to get himself elected the president of the United States under what I would have considered almost impossible odds.
Were you confident with your decision to retire?
Yes.
How come?
A number of different reasons. I'm getting older. I have spent too many late nights working till 4 o'clock in the morning, and 50 years really in the business of deadlines. And I wanted to live my last days free of stress. I wanted to remove it from my life. I was never very good at dealing with it. And I wanted to enjoy myself. I also saw, to be honest with you, I saw the changes that were starting to happen. And I wasn't happy with some of them. And I thought that it was going to be a much more difficult environment to operate under, to operate in. And I figured that this was a good time to go.
When you speak about stress, I wonder what part of the job was stressful, most stressful for you than any other part? The interviewing, the preparation, the editing, the deadline?
I think that the pressure was the pressure that I put on myself to do the best job that I possibly could to try and uphold the standards of this show of 60 Minutes, and to meet the standards, or try and meet the standards of the people that I worked with. And to me, that was really important. And I didn't think that when I came there, you did absolutely the best you could. You were never satisfied until the deadline came and put the story on the air. And I just felt like all I was doing was trying to maintain those standards in a way that I could do it with my limited abilities.
Any story you refused to do?
There have been a couple. I can't really remember what. I want to go back to what I was talking about earlier.
Go ahead.
About the fact that you know, the problem of conflicts of interest or certain stories that you can't do. Now, I have no way of knowing this is a real story or not, but I heard it a long time ago, and I believe it, that there was a conversation going on between the editor of Rolling Stone and Ralph Nader. And the editor of Rolling Stone said, "There's no story we can't do and won't do." And he said, "That's BS. You're not going to do a story on how the mafia controls newspaper and magazine distribution in this country." And he was right. There are always things that are going to make those kinds. You're always going to run into some things that you don't feel you can report on because you're not going to be able to report them out.
But it's interesting, it was Ralph Nader, the left-wing activist, who said that, and now it's Steve Croft saying it, saying that, yeah, it's interesting that many mainstream media organizations, from the Rolling Stones perhaps to CBS, there are stories they wouldn't run.
Or stories that you didn't feel you could do. That, I think, was the way I took your question. And I think that there were times when I felt, I can remember I do remember a story. I can remember when I was in the London Bureau as a correspondent for the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, and the Bhopal incident happened. Union Carbide at explosion that was a horrible, horrible accident. My father had worked for Union Carbide for 40 years. I had grown up surrounded by that company. And I knew from conversations that I'd had with him that there were people that knew about the dangers of the chemical business that dwarfed what my father used to say, the threat of nuclear power and nuclear accidents. And I didn't feel like I was the person to do that story. I felt like I had too many things in my own mind going on that were my own personal feelings, and I didn't want to be. Also, I thought that I had a clear conflict of interest and I shouldn't do that story. Obviously, it had to be done, but I didn't feel like I could do it, and I said I wouldn't do it.
So we don't always cover everything. What's the best advice? What's the best advice, Steve, you ever got as a journalist?
Be conscious. Don't let yourself be contaminated by the political atmosphere and by your donors. That you need to be out. You need to establish yourself. Right now, there's just nobody in the middle. There's just very, very, very few alternatives, very few people and organizations left that will present both sides of the story. Not necessarily equally, but at least in I like to use the word fair, to be fair. And Don Hewitt always used to say, if you're doing this story, just give them one last break, just throw in there something that, that explains their feelings. I mean, I'm talking about the target of an investigation.
Right.
That
give him some grace, or her.
Yes. And it's not going to be, don't be afraid to let them have the opposite side have their say. I mean, obviously you don't want to let them tell lies. And if they do try and tell you lies, you come back and you point those lies out. But I think that there's a responsibility that you want to have people left with the thought that you did your best to give them all the information that you thought was relevant to the story that you were doing. And I don't think you have to necessarily bend over backwards, but I do think that you should be fair. I'm not saying balanced, because I think that's going too far on the other direction, but fair. And I think it was well served. I think it served me. I think it served Don Hewitt well, and he was the person at 60 Minutes that created it. I mean, he used to say, you know, I don't like the term investigative reporting, and I don't like the term investigative journalism. It makes it sound self-important. It's all reporting. Reporting is supposed to be investigating. And all investigative reporters do is they do reporting, and they have more time. They have the luxury of more time to follow the who, what, why, where, when to the next layer and keep peeling back who, what, why, where, until you get as close as you can to get to the truth. And I like to think that journalism is more important than the word investigative.
It's interesting. You're saying all reporters ask the 5 Ws. We investigative reporters have to ask them over and over again. But we do basically reporting. All of us are doing reporting. And
who really are the people that are involved in this story? What are their motives? What are their possible motives? Who might have influenced their decisions? What political background is at play? What parts of the system, as we might call it, are at play in trying to control the way this story is presented? There are certain roadblocks, systemic roadblocks that you run into when you're doing this job. The biggest one, I think, is that people are going to lie to you, particularly government officials, and particularly people who are trying to direct the story, whether it's corporate PR or whoever. You're going to get lied to. There are going to be a lot of people that are going to try and get you to print something, and it's your job to sit through and figure it out.
It's something that Ben Bradley, the late editor of the Washington Post, said that his main lesson after Watergate was, when you get the formal truth, go search for the true truth. And I guess that's always true. And before we say goodbye, Steve, I think those last words of yours, which were said with so much passion, resonate with what your colleagues at 60 Minutes wrote to you or about you when you said goodbye. And they wrote, without his eye for the outrageous, without his willingness to unpack the complicated stories most reporters would tell you are impossible to tell on television, and most of all, without his elegant, spare writing that serves the story without ever calling attention to itself, anyone here just calls him Croft, and without him, 60 Minutes will not be the same. 60 Minutes probably is not the same. And it was a pleasure, Steve, to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for your time.
And good luck.
And for everything else you did. Thank you very much, Steve. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Best of luck.